Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. April had just turned cold again when I got the call about the house. My childhood home in Millbridge, Vermont, had been sitting empty for 18 months since Dad passed, and the lawyer said it was time to either sell or commit to the property taxes. I'd been avoiding it, honestly. The place held too many memories, and not all of them were the kind you want to revisit. But my apartment lease in Boston was ending, and I figured 2 weeks in Vermont wouldn't kill me. I could sort through decades of accumulated stuff, get the house ready for listing, and maybe find some closure. The drive up through New Hampshire felt longer than I remembered. The mountains pressing in on both sides of the highway, still patched with dirty snow even though it was late March. Millbridge hadn't changed much. Population 3,200, one stoplight, 3 churches, and a general store that doubled as the post office. The kind of place where everyone knows your business before you do. The house looked smaller than it did in my memories. The white paint had gone gray in patches, and the apple orchard behind the property had grown wild, branches tangled together like arthritic fingers reaching toward the sky. Dad had stopped maintaining it after Mom died in 2009. I'd been away at college then, and when I came back for the funeral, the orchard was already starting its slow surrender to nature. Now it looked like something out of a fairy tale, the kind that doesn't end well. I'd hired a local kid, Andrew Brennan, to help me haul stuff to the dump. His mom had been friends with my mom back in high school, and he needed money for community college. He showed up on Monday morning in a pickup truck that sounded like it was held together by prayer and duct tape. We started in the attic, where Dad had stored everything he couldn't bear to throw away. Boxes of Christmas decorations, old tax returns, my school projects from elementary school. It was going to be a long 2 weeks. The photo fell out of a water-damaged cardboard box labeled Kitchen Misk in Mom's handwriting. I almost missed it, would have if the corner hadn't caught the light just right. It was a Polaroid. The colors faded to that weird orange-yellow tint they get after a few decades. 5 teenage girls stood in a line, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera. They were dressed in that unmistakable late 80s style, all big hair and acid-wash denim and neon windbreakers. I recognized Mom immediately. Second from the left, her dark hair permed into oblivion. She couldn't have been more than 16, maybe 17. The photo had been taken in front of our orchard. I could see the neat rows of apple trees in the background before they'd gone wild. Someone had written on the white border at the bottom in blue pen, "Summer 1987, best friends forever." I flipped it over. On the back, in different handwriting, were 5 names: Diane, Julie, Mom's name, Vanessa, and Christine. I'd never seen this photo before. Mom had hardly any pictures from her teenage years, said she didn't like having her photo taken back then. But here she was, looking genuinely happy, surrounded by girls I'd never heard her mention. I showed it to Andrew, who was wrestling with a box of old National Geographic magazines. He glanced at it and shrugged. "Looks like your mom had friends," he said. "That's the orchard, right?" Before it went crazy. I asked if he recognized any of the other girls, if their families still lived in town. He squinted at the photo, then pointed to the girl on the far right, a blonde with a prominent gap between her front teeth. That might be Christine Holloway. "There's still a Holloway family on Birch Road, but I don't know if they're related." He handed the photo back to me and went back to the magazines. Something about it bothered me, though, the way it had been tucked away in a random box, like someone had hidden it deliberately. That night after Andrew left, I sat at the kitchen table with a bottle of Dad's old whiskey and stared at those 5 smiling faces. Mom's smile looked different than I remembered it, more open, less weighted down by whatever had made her so quiet in her later years. The next morning, I drove into town with the photo in my jacket pocket. The Millbridge Public Library was in the same building as the town hall, a brick structure that smelled like old paper and floor wax. Mrs. Galloway, the librarian who'd been there since before I was born, looked up from her desk with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes when I walked in. I told her I was doing some family history research, that I'd found an old photo of my mom and wanted to learn more about her friends. She got very still when I showed her the picture. Her finger traced over the faces, lingering on each one. "Where did you find this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I told her it had been in a box in the attic. She handed it back quickly, like it had burned her. "Those girls," she said, then stopped. "Most of them moved away a long time ago. You know how it is with small towns? People leave." But there was something in the way she said it, something rehearsed, like she'd told this story before and had gotten good at making it sound casual. I pressed her, asked specifically about each name. Mrs. Galloway's jaw tightened. "Diane moved to California in 1988. Julie, I think she went to New York. Vanessa, maybe Florida. Christine stayed the longest, but she left too. Must have been 1989 or 1990. Every answer came out too quickly, too prepared. I asked if she had yearbooks from that era. Maybe I could find more information about them. She told me the yearbooks from those years had been damaged in a flood in the basement back in 2003. Most of them were thrown out. Convenient, I thought, but didn't say. I thanked her and left, but as I reached the door, she called out, "Your mother wouldn't want you digging into this." I turned around. "Into what?" She just shook her head and went back to her computer, fingers trembling slightly as they found the keyboard. Outside, I sat in my car for a long time, engine running, heat blasting. The whole conversation felt wrong. People don't react like that to a simple question about old high school friends, not unless there's something to hide. I spent the rest of that day at the town hall, going through old newspaper archives on microfiche. The Millbridge Gazette was a weekly paper, mostly local sports and town council meetings, but I figured Disappearances would make the news. I searched every issue from 1987 through 1992. Nothing. Not a single article about missing girls, runaways, or disappearances. There were obituaries, sure, but none for anyone matching those names or ages. What I did find was strange in its absence. There were gaps in the papers, issues that should have existed but didn't. July 1987 was missing. October 1988 had 3 consecutive weeks gone. Spring of 1989, another gap. I asked the clerk about it, a young guy who clearly didn't care much about his job. He said sometimes issues got damaged or lost over the years, it happens, but the pattern felt deliberate. Those weren't random gaps. I drove to the address Andrew had mentioned, the Holloway place on Birch Road. It was a small ranch house with peeling yellow paint and a yard full of cars in various states of disrepair. An older man answered the door, maybe in his 70s, with suspicious eyes and a Boston Red Sox cap pulled low. I introduced myself, said I was looking for information about Christine Holloway. His face changed instantly, not sad, but angry. "You a reporter?" he asked, his hand tightening on the doorframe. I told him no, that I was just trying to learn about my mom's old friends. He stared at me for a long moment, then said, "Christine ran away in 1989. Took off in the middle of the night, didn't leave a note, nothing. Police said she was 18, free to go where she wanted. End of story." But his voice cracked when he said her name. I asked if he'd ever heard from her after she left. He shook his head. "Not a word in 36 years. Her mother died thinking Christine hated us. You want to know the truth? The truth is this town let her disappear and nobody gave a damn." He started to close the door, then stopped. "Your uncle was the police chief back then, Harold Weaver. He told us Christine was a troubled girl, that she'd probably gone to find herself in some city somewhere. He said we should let it go, that she'd come back when she was ready. We believed him." The door shut in my face before I could respond. Uncle Harold. Mom's older brother, the one who died of a heart attack when I was 12. I barely remembered him, just a stern man in a uniform who showed up at family holidays and didn't smile much. When I got back to the house, Andrew was loading broken furniture into his truck. I asked him if he knew anything about girls disappearing in the late 80s. He stopped mid-lift, an old chair suspended in his arms. "My mom mentioned something once," he said slowly. She said there were some girls who left town back when she was in high school. But she got really weird when I asked about it, told me it was ancient history and I should focus on my own life. He set the chair down. Why are you asking? I showed him the photo again, explained what I'd learned. He looked uncomfortable. Look, I need this job, but I don't want to get involved in something that's going to piss off the whole town. My family lives here. I told him I understood, that he didn't have to help me with this part. But then he said something that made my chest tighten. There's an old storage unit out by Route 7. Police department used to keep evidence there before they built the new station. My uncle works maintenance for the facility. He said most of the old units haven't been touched in decades. If your uncle kept anything, it might still be there. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Mom, about how quiet she'd been my whole life, how she never talked about her childhood or her friends, how she'd sometimes stare out at the orchard with this look on her face, like she was seeing something that wasn't there anymore. I'd always assumed she was just sad about getting older, about how time changes things. But now I wondered if she'd been carrying something heavier. Around 2 in the morning, I gave up on sleep and went down to the kitchen. The house made different sounds at night, creaks and groans I'd forgotten about. I made coffee and sat at the table with my laptop, searching for any information I could find about the other girls. Diane, Julie, Vanessa. Nothing came up. No social media profiles, no obituaries, no marriage records, nothing. It was like they'd been erased. 5 girls in one photo, and 4 of them had vanished without leaving a single digital footprint. In a world where everyone exists online in some form, that kind of absence isn't accidental. Somebody had worked very hard to make sure these girls stayed gone, at least on paper. I thought about Uncle Harold, about his position of authority, about how easy it would be for a small-town police chief to make inconvenient questions disappear along with inconvenient people. The storage facility was a depressing row of metal units behind a chain-link fence, the kind of place that rents month to month and doesn't ask questions. Andrew's uncle, a heavy-set man named Don with nicotine-stained fingers, met me there on Wednesday morning. I'd told him I was looking for some of my uncle's old police files for a family history project. He didn't seem to care either way. Unit 23, he said, handing me a key that looked like it hadn't been used in years. Haven't seen anyone access that one since before I started working here, and that was 2007. You find anything valuable? The department technically still owns it. The unit smelled like mildew and rust when I rolled up the door. Boxes were stacked to the ceiling, most of them labeled with case numbers and dates. I started pulling them down, searching for anything from 1987 to 1990. Most of it was routine stuff, traffic violations, petty theft reports, one domestic dispute case. Then, in a box marked MISC 1988-1989, I found a folder that made my hands go numb. It was labeled Informal Investigations in Uncle Harold's handwriting. Inside were newspaper clippings from other states, articles about unidentified remains found in rural areas. He'd circled certain details in red pen, details about age, gender, approximate time of death. There were also Polaroids, dozens of them, taken in the orchard behind my house. They showed disturbed earth, areas where the ground had clearly been dug up and refilled. Each photo had a date written on the back: July 1987, October 1988, April 1989, May 1989. My legs gave out and I sat down hard on the concrete floor. The dates matched the gaps in the newspaper archives. They matched the timeline of when the girls supposedly ran away. I pulled out my phone with shaking fingers and took pictures of everything in that folder. Every article, every photo, every note. There was a handwritten log too, Uncle Harold's daily notes. Most entries were mundane, but scattered throughout were lines that made my stomach turn. Spoke with Holloway family again. They're accepting the runaway story. Diane's parents finally stopped calling. Convincing people these girls wanted to leave is easier than I thought. Small-town prejudices work in my favor. And then, near the end of the log, one entry that broke something inside me. Spoke to my sister today. She knows, she's always known. But she won't say anything. Family protects family, even when it shouldn't. My mother had known. She'd known what happened to her friends, and she'd stayed silent for the rest of her life, carrying that weight alone because her brother was a murderer and she couldn't bring herself to turn him in. I drove straight to the Vermont State Police Barracks in Rutland, 40 minutes away, with the folder on my passenger seat. I didn't trust anyone in Millbridge. The detective I spoke with, a woman named Carver, listened to everything without interrupting. When I showed her the photos and the log, her expression went from skeptical to grave. She made calls, and within hours, a forensics team was on its way to my property. They spent 3 days searching the orchard with ground-penetrating radar. They found 4 sets of remains buried in shallow graves exactly where Uncle Harold's photos indicated: Diane, Julie, Vanessa, and Christine. The 5th girl in the photo, my mother, had been the sole survivor, the one who got away because she was his sister. And even monsters sometimes have limits. The town exploded with the news. Some people were horrified, others were angry that I'd dug up the past. Mrs. Galloway refused to speak to anyone. Christine's father called me, sobbing, saying he'd waited 36 years to know what happened to his daughter, and thanking me for giving him that closure, even though it came with such terrible truth. I sold the house within a month. Couldn't stand to be there anymore. The orchard was excavated completely, turned into a memorial garden for the victims. Before I left Vermont for good, I went back one last time and stood where that photo had been taken in 1987. 5 girls smiling at the camera, none of them knowing that 4 would be dead within 2 years, and the 5th would spend the rest of her life drowning in guilt and silence. I understood now why Mom had been so quiet, why she never wanted to talk about her past, why she'd look at the orchard with that haunted expression. She'd been looking at their graves, living above the evidence of her brother's crimes, knowing the truth but never speaking it, protecting a monster because he was family. I'll never know if she stayed silent out of fear or misplaced loyalty, and maybe it doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that those 4 girls finally got to go home to their families, even if it was 3 decades too late. I still have that photo, tucked away in a drawer I rarely open. Sometimes I take it out and look at those 5 faces, all that youth and possibility, and I think about how one person's evil can ripple through generations, destroying not just the victims but everyone connected to them. The house sold to a family from Massachusetts who had no idea about its history. I didn't tell them. Maybe that makes me like my mother, keeping secrets to protect people from ugly truths. Or maybe some stories need to be buried along with the dead. I don't know anymore. What I do know is that I'll never go back to Millbridge, and every time I see an apple orchard, I drive past it as fast as I can. People always ask why I became a journalist, and I usually give them some noble answer about truth and accountability. The real reason is simpler and darker than that. It started the day I came home to Cypress Bend, Louisiana to pack up my father's house after his funeral. Dad had been the town clerk for 40 years before retiring in 2014, and he'd kept everything. Every document, every file, every scrap of paper that passed through the municipal building ended up in our garage or attic. My older sister Kathleen refused to deal with it, said she had 3 kids and a husband to worry about, so the job fell to me. I'd just turned 36 the week before Dad died. No wife, no kids, just a decent job at a newspaper in Atlanta covering city council meetings and zoning disputes, the kind of stories that put people to sleep. I took a month's leave and drove the 9 hours back to the place I'd spent my whole childhood trying to escape. The house looked smaller than I remembered, the way childhood places always do. It sat on Magnolia Avenue, a street that used to be nice before the chemical plant laid off half the town in 2008. Dad's Toyota was still in the driveway, covered in that yellow pollen that coats everything in Louisiana during spring. It was a Saturday in May, humid as hell, and the cicadas were already screaming in the oak trees. I'd been dreading this for weeks. Not just because of the grief, but because I knew what waited inside. Dad had been a hoarder of the bureaucratic kind. The living room was stacked with banker's boxes, the hallway lined with filing cabinets, the spare bedroom converted into what he called his archive. Mom had left him over it back when I was in college, said she couldn't live in a museum anymore. She'd remarried and moved to Florida, sent flowers to the funeral but didn't come. I couldn't blame her. The house smelled like old paper and the lemon cleaner Dad used obsessively, trying to keep the mold at bay. I stood in the doorway with my duffel bag, looking at the mountain of work ahead, and seriously considered just hiring an estate sale company to deal with all of it. I started in the garage because it seemed the least personal. Boxes were stacked to the ceiling, labeled in Dad's careful block letters. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect. Tax records, water bills from 1987, permits for shed construction, complaints about barking dogs, boring, mundane stuff that should have been thrown out decades ago. I worked methodically, creating piles for trash, recycling, and the maybe 5% worth keeping. By noon, I was covered in dust and spider webs, my back aching from bending over boxes. I'd filled 6 garbage bags and barely made a dent. That's when I found them, pushed way back in the corner behind a rusted lawnmower and some old paint cans. 4 boxes, sealed with packing tape that had gone brown and brittle with age. The labels were different from Dad's usual style, written in black marker, hurried and uneven. Flood Relief 93, do not open. The thing is, I remembered 1993. I was 7 years old when the flood hit. School got canceled for 2 weeks, and we had to stay with my aunt in Baton Rouge because water came up to our porch steps. It was the biggest disaster in Cypress Bend's history, the whole downtown underwater, people living in the high school gymnasium for months. But what struck me standing in that garage was the second part of the label. Why would Dad write, "Do not open," on relief documents? I pulled one of the boxes out, the cardboard soft with moisture damage despite being sealed. It was heavier than I expected. I carried it to Dad's workbench and grabbed a utility knife from the pegboard. My journalist instincts were kicking in now, that familiar buzz I got when something didn't add up. I cut through the tape, and the smell hit me first. Old paper, but also something else, something chemical and wrong. Inside were files, hundreds of them, organized with the same precision Dad brought to everything. But these weren't relief documents. They were missing persons reports. Dozens of them, maybe 50 or 60 in just this one box. Each form was the official kind, the Louisiana State Police template with the seal at the top. But someone had stamped them all with red ink. Not processed. I pulled one out at random. A woman named Gloria Thibodeau, 41 years old, last seen at her home on Riverside Court on Wednesday, June 9, 1993. The report was filed by her sister on June 15th. There was a Polaroid photo paperclipped to the form, showing a smiling woman with dark curly hair standing in front of a small yellow house. I grabbed another file. James Ortega, 19, last seen leaving his job at the marina on the same date, June 9th. Another photo, a skinny kid with a work uniform and a shy smile. Then another, Carolyn Dufresne and her 2 daughters, ages 8 and 11. All last seen June 9th, 1993. All reported missing in the days after. All stamped, not processed. My heart started pounding in a way that had nothing to do with the garage heat. June 9th, 1993 was the day the levee broke. I remembered because it was my grandmother's birthday, and we were supposed to have cake that evening, but never did because the sirens started going off around 3 in the afternoon. The Riverside neighborhood got hit first and worst, the water coming in so fast that people barely had time to get to their roofs. The news said it was 20 feet deep in some places. I grabbed my phone and started Googling, pulling up the old newspaper archives from the Cypress Bend Chronicle. The official death toll from the flood was listed as 7 people. 7. I had at least 30 missing persons reports in my hands from just one box, and there were 3 more boxes in that corner. I started pulling files faster, my hands getting that tremble you get when you're onto something big. Every single report had the same date, June 9th, 1993. Every single person was from Riverside, and every single form had that red stamp. Someone had deliberately not processed these reports. Someone had made these people disappear from the official record. I spent the next 4 hours going through all 4 boxes. By the time I finished, I'd counted 147 missing persons reports. 147 people who vanished the day of the flood, all from the same neighborhood, all officially erased. The files included everything you'd expect: detailed descriptions, last known locations, family contacts, even some personal effects that had been turned in. A wallet, a set of house keys, a child's stuffed rabbit, water-stained and falling apart. Someone had taken these reports seriously enough to collect evidence, but then buried them. I found something else too, tucked into the bottom of the last box. A manila envelope marked, "Engineering Survey, Confidential." Inside were blueprints of the levee system, covered in notations and calculations in different handwriting. Yellow sticky notes were attached to several pages, and one note made my stomach turn. It was dated June 8, 1993, the day before the flood. The handwriting was shaky but legible. Charges placed as requested. Primary breach point north sector will direct flow to Riverside. Detonation window 2:04 p.m. Wednesday. God forgive us. I sat down hard on Dad's workbench stool, my legs suddenly unreliable. Someone had blown the levee on purpose. They deliberately flooded Riverside, and my father had known about it. The evidence was in his garage, hidden for 31 years. I thought about Dad's last few months, how he'd gotten quiet and withdrawn, how he'd stopped going to church even though he'd been an usher for 20 years, how he'd called me 3 times in the weeks before his heart attack, leaving rambling messages about needing to tell me something important. But I'd been busy with a story deadline and kept saying I'd call him back later. I never did. Now he was gone, and I was holding proof of mass murder. I pulled out my laptop and started searching for anything about Riverside neighborhood. What I found made everything worse. After the flood, the land had been declared unusable, too damaged to rebuild. The entire neighborhood, 43 acres, had been sold to a development company for next to nothing. That company was owned by the Prudhomme family. Everyone in Cypress Bend knew the Prudhommes. They owned half the parish, had for generations. Sugarcane plantations, timber operations, commercial real estate. The family estate sat on a hill overlooking the river, a white mansion with columns that had been there since before the Civil War. In 1993, the patriarch was Jean-Paul Prudhomme, and according to the property records I was pulling up, his holdings had been directly upstream from Riverside. If the levee had broken naturally where it was supposed to, the water would have flooded his processing plant and 5,000 acres of prime agricultural land. But by breaching it at the north sector instead, the water got diverted away from his property and straight into Riverside, a poor neighborhood where most people rented, where nobody had the money or connections to fight back. I found a photo from the Chronicle dated June 11, 1993, showing Jean-Paul touring the flood damage with the governor. He looked concerned in that practiced way rich people do, wearing rubber boots that probably cost more than most people's rent. The caption mentioned his generous donation to the relief fund. Blood money. I couldn't stay in that garage anymore. I loaded all 4 boxes into my car, then went back for the engineering documents. It was almost 7 in the evening, the sun setting orange and angry through the humidity. I sat in my car with the air conditioning blasting, trying to figure out what to do next. The smart move would be to call the FBI, hand everything over, let the professionals handle it. But I'd been a journalist long enough to know how these things went. The Prudhommes had money, real money, the kind that bought lawyers and politicians and made evidence disappear. Jean-Paul was dead now, had been for a decade, but his son Olivier ran the family business and sat on every important board in the parish. One phone call from him and this whole thing could get buried again, just like Dad had buried it. No, I needed to document everything first, build an airtight case, and then go public in a way that couldn't be ignored. I drove to the one place in Cypress Bend I knew would have the records I needed, the parish courthouse. The building was closed, but I'd grown up in this town and knew things tourists didn't. The records room had a separate entrance in the back, and the night security guard was Billy Fontaine, who'd been 2 grades ahead of me in school. I knocked on the maintenance door until he opened it, looking annoyed until he recognized me. We talked for 10 minutes about Dad's funeral, about his own father's diabetes, about how the town wasn't what it used to be. Then I told him I needed to look at some property records for a story I was writing, and he let me in without asking questions. Small town courtesy, the kind that can save you or destroy you depending on who's watching. I spent 3 hours in that records room, photographing everything. Deeds, tax assessments, water management reports, environmental surveys. I found the original engineering specifications for the levee, which showed the north sector was actually reinforced concrete, the strongest point in the entire system. For it to fail there naturally would have been nearly impossible. I found insurance claims too, dozens of them, all denied because flood insurance didn't cover acts of God back then. People lost everything and got nothing. The last thing I found was a memo dated June 15, 1993, from the Parish Emergency Management Office to all local law enforcement. It ordered them to halt processing of any missing persons reports from Riverside until further notice, citing the need to avoid premature panic and allow time for thorough rescue operations. The memo was signed by the emergency coordinator, a man named Frank Boudreau, but at the bottom was a handwritten note, per prud'homme request. That's when I understood what Dad had done. He hadn't been part of the conspiracy. He'd been the one person who'd refused to destroy the evidence. Everyone else had followed orders, but Dad had kept those reports, hidden them, preserved them for 31 years until someone could do something about it. He'd tried to tell me before he died, and I'd been too busy to listen. I left the courthouse at midnight with my phone full of documentation and a plan forming in my head. I couldn't trust the local police. Half of them probably owed their jobs to Prud'homme donations. But I had friends at the Times-Picayune in New Orleans, and I had enough evidence to make this national news. I drove back to Dad's house, uploaded everything to 3 different cloud services, and sent encrypted files to 2 journalist colleagues with instructions to publish if anything happened to me. Then I finally allowed myself to feel it, the weight of what I'd discovered, and I cried for the first time since Dad's funeral. The story broke 6 days later. I'd spent that time tracking down survivors, people who'd lost family members in Riverside and never got answers. Most had moved away, scattered across Louisiana and beyond, but they all remembered. They remembered filing reports that went nowhere, remembered being told their loved ones probably just left town, remembered the way people stopped asking questions when the Prud'homme name came up. I interviewed 23 people, recorded every conversation, documented every detail. When the Times-Picayune published the first article, it included photographs of the missing persons reports, scans of the engineering documents, and testimony from the survivors. The headline read, "Cypress Bend Flood of '93. New evidence suggests deliberate levee breach killed over 140. Within hours, every major news outlet in the country picked it up. CNN, NBC, The Washington Post. By the end of the week, the FBI had opened an investigation, and the Louisiana Attorney General announced a special task force. Olivier Prud'homme released a statement calling the allegations baseless and defamatory, but his lawyers couldn't explain away the documents. The physical evidence was too damning, too specific, too real. 3 months later, they found the bodies. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of the old Riverside neighborhood, which was now a shopping center and parking lot, revealed multiple unmarked burial sites. The excavation took weeks, but they eventually recovered remains of 68 people, including children. DNA testing confirmed their identities matched names from Dad's missing persons reports. The medical examiner determined most had drowned, but some showed signs of blunt force trauma, suggesting they'd been caught in the initial blast when the levee was breached. Olivier Prud'homme was indicted on charges of obstruction of justice and conspiracy to conceal evidence. He maintained his father had acted alone, but financial records showed he'd paid off 3 parish officials as recently as 2023 to keep the Riverside files sealed. Frank Boudreau, the old emergency coordinator, confessed in exchange for immunity. He confirmed Jean-Paul Prudhomme had ordered the levee breach and paid the demolition crew $500,000 in cash. The crew members were dead now, conveniently all of natural causes over the past decade. But Boudreau's testimony was enough. The trial starts next month, and I'll be there to cover every minute of it. I still live in Cypress Bend now. Quit my job in Atlanta and took a position at the Chronicle, the same paper that once published puff pieces about Jean-Paul's charity work. They made me investigative editor, gave me full freedom to dig into whatever stories the town tried to bury. Kathleen speaks to me again, said she's proud of what I did, even if it means the family name is complicated around here. Some people treat me like a hero, others won't make eye contact at the grocery store. The Prudhommes still have friends, still have money, still have power, but they don't have silence anymore. Dad's house sold last month, and I used part of the money to help fund a memorial for the Riverside victims. It's a simple granite wall with all 147 names engraved, located on the only piece of the old neighborhood that wasn't developed, a small park by the river. At the dedication ceremony, survivors came from all over the country. They touched the names, cried, finally had a place to grieve. I think about Dad standing in that garage looking at those boxes year after year, carrying the weight of what he knew and couldn't fix. He did what he could with what he had, and in the end, that was enough. The truth came out, even if it took 31 years and his death to make it happen. Sometimes justice is just someone refusing to let the world forget. Honestly, I never thought I'd be the person posting something like this online, but I need to get it out somewhere because talking about it in person makes me feel sick all over again. My wife Claire and I got married in June 2014, right after I finished my teaching degree. We were broke as hell, living off her salary as a dental hygienist while I scrambled for substitute teaching gigs around the county. When we found that rental house on the edge of Fairmont, Pennsylvania, it felt like we'd won the lottery. 2 bedrooms, hardwood floors, a little backyard for the dog we planned to get someday, all for $800 a month. The landlord, this guy named Vincent Marsh, seemed normal enough when we met him at the property. Mid-50s, thinning gray hair, wore these thick-framed glasses that made his eyes look huge. He smiled a lot, maybe too much, but we figured he was just eager to rent the place after it sat empty for 3 months. We moved in on a Saturday in late July, and I remember thinking the house had good bones despite the outdated wallpaper and the weird, musty smell in the hallway closet. Claire was already planning which walls we'd repaint, talking about hanging curtains in the bedroom to block out the streetlight that shone directly through our window at night. That first week felt like playing house, you know. We'd order pizza and eat it on the floor, because our furniture hadn't arrived yet, making plans about the life we were going to build there. Vincent stopped by twice that week, once to fix a leaky faucet and another time to check the furnace before winter, he said. Both times he lingered longer than necessary, asking questions about our schedules, when we'd be home, whether we were light sleepers. Claire mentioned later that she thought it was weird how he kept glancing toward our bedroom door, but I brushed it off. Landlords are nosy, right? They want to make sure you're not trashing their property. I wish I'd paid more attention to the way his hands trembled when he handed me his business card, or how he wrote his personal cell number on the back in pen that smudged across the paper like he'd been sweating. It was Claire who noticed the first hole. We'd been living there almost 3 weeks when she decided to rearrange the bedroom furniture. She wanted the bed against the far wall instead of under the window, thought it would help us sleep better without that streetlight blazing into our faces every night. When we pushed the dresser away from the corner, there it was, right at eye level if you were standing in the hallway outside. A perfectly round hole, maybe half an inch across, drilled straight through the drywall. The edges were smooth, deliberate, and when I put my eye up to it, I could see directly into our bedroom, a clear view of where our bed had been positioned for the past 3 weeks. My throat got tight. Claire grabbed my arm, her fingernails digging in hard enough to leave marks. We stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably just a minute, both of us trying to rationalize it. Maybe the previous tenant hung something heavy. Maybe there was some electrical work done, but the hole was too clean, too purposeful, and it was aimed at exactly the right height and angle. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and started checking the other walls, moving furniture, pulling down the few pictures we'd hung. We found 2 more in the bedroom alone. One behind the nightstand on Claire's side, another near the closet that gave a perfect view of where she changed clothes every morning before work. The panic really set in when we checked the bathroom. I had to move the towel rack to find it, but there it was. Another hole drilled through the wall that separated the bathroom from the utility closet in the hallway. This one was positioned to see directly into the shower. Claire started crying, the kind of crying where you can't catch your breath, and I felt this rage building in my chest that made my vision blur at the edges. We'd been showering there for 3 weeks. We'd been sleeping there, changing there, doing everything married people do in the privacy of their own home. I wanted to punch something, wanted to drive straight to Vincent's house and drag him out by his collar, but Claire begged me to call the police first. She was shaking so badly I had to dial the number for her. When the dispatcher answered, I tried to explain what we'd found, but the words came out jumbled and probably didn't make much sense. The dispatcher kept asking if we were in immediate danger, if someone was in the house right now, and I kept saying no, but yes. Someone had been watching us. Someone had violated us in a way I couldn't even articulate. They said they'd send an officer over within the hour. That hour felt like a decade. While we waited, I couldn't just sit there. I went into the hallway closet, the one with that musty smell we'd never bothered investigating, and started pulling out the boxes of Christmas decorations and old paint cans the previous tenant had left behind. At the back of the closet, behind a sheet of plywood leaning against the wall, I found the access panel to the crawl space above the first floor. The panel wasn't screwed in like it should have been. It just lifted right off. I grabbed a chair from the kitchen, boosted myself up, and shone the flashlight into the darkness above. What I saw made my stomach turn inside out. There were wires everywhere, thin black cables running along the ceiling joists like veins, all converging toward a central point above our bedroom. I followed them with the flashlight beam and found a small metal box bolted to a beam, about the size of a lunchbox, with more wires feeding into it from different directions. Some of the cables disappeared into holes drilled down through the ceiling, positioned exactly where we'd found the holes in the walls below. I'm not an electrician, but I knew enough to recognize that this wasn't original wiring. This was new, maybe a few months old based on how clean the plastic coating looked. Claire called up to me asking what I'd found, but I couldn't form words. I just climbed down and showed her the pictures I'd taken on my phone. Her face went completely white. The officer who showed up was young, couldn't have been more than a year or 2 out of the academy. His name was Officer Reynolds, and he had this uncomfortable expression like he'd been expecting a noise complaint, not whatever mess we were describing. He looked at the holes, took some pictures with the department camera, then asked if he could see the crawl space. I took him up there, and I watched his expression change from skeptical to deeply concerned as he swept his own flashlight across the wiring. He made a phone call, spoke in that clipped cop voice they use on radios, and within 20 minutes 2 detectives showed up. Detective Brenner was older, maybe 50, with gray stubble and tired eyes that had seen too much. His partner was a woman named Detective Huang, sharp and focused, already pulling on latex gloves before she'd even climbed into the crawl space. They spent 45 minutes up there talking in low voices we couldn't quite hear, occasionally asking us questions through the opening. Had we touched anything? Had we noticed anyone unusual around the property? Did the landlord have keys? That last question hit different. Of course he had keys. He was the landlord. He could come and go whenever he wanted, and we'd never know. Detective Huang came down from the crawl space holding an evidence bag with the metal box inside. She set it on our kitchen table like it was radioactive, and Brenner explained what they'd found. The box was a wireless transmitter, the kind you could buy online for a few $100s, designed to send video signals to a remote receiver. The wires fed into tiny cameras, pinhole style, fitted into the holes we'd discovered. 4 cameras total, they'd counted. Bedroom, bathroom, and 2 in the living room we hadn't even found yet because they were hidden behind air vents. Huang asked if we'd given permission for any surveillance equipment, which was such an absurd question I almost laughed. Then Brenner asked for Vincent's contact information, and I handed over that business card with his smudged cell number. They tried calling him right there in front of us. It rang 6 times and went to voicemail. Brenner left a message, professional and calm, asking Vincent to call back regarding an urgent matter at the property. We all knew he wouldn't call back. You could see it in the way the detectives looked at each other. That silent communication cops develop after working together long enough. Huang asked if we had anywhere else to stay tonight. The way she said it, like it wasn't really a question, made it clear we shouldn't be sleeping there. We ended up at Claire's parents' house in Harrisburg, about an hour away. Her mom kept trying to make tea and asking if we were hungry, doing that thing parents do when they don't know how to fix something, so they offer food instead. Claire's dad just sat there looking furious, his jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might crack. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that metal box, those wires, Vincent's huge eyes behind those thick glasses staring at footage of us in our most private moments. How long had he been watching? Had he watched us on our wedding night when we came home late and exhausted? Had he seen every fight, every intimate moment, every time we walked around in our underwear thinking we were alone? The violation of it felt like something crawling under my skin. The next morning, Brenner called my cell. They'd gone to the address listed on Vincent's landlord registration. The house was empty. Not just empty like he wasn't home, but empty like he'd cleared out in a hurry. Neighbors said they'd seen him loading boxes into a van around midnight, just hours after we'd called the police. His cell phone was going straight to voicemail now, probably turned off or destroyed. They'd put out a bulletin for his vehicle, a white cargo van with Pennsylvania plates, but Brenner didn't sound optimistic about finding him quickly. What happened next is the part that still keeps me awake sometimes. 3 days after Vincent disappeared, Detective Huang called and asked if we could come down to the station. When we got there, she led us into a conference room where Brenner had spread out papers and photographs across the table, like some kind of horrifying puzzle. They'd started digging into Vincent's background, pulling property records and cross-referencing rental listings. Turns out our house wasn't the only one. Vincent owned 6 rental properties scattered across 3 counties in central Pennsylvania, all advertised as affordable housing for young couples and single women. The detectives had obtained warrants and searched every single property. 5 of them had the same setup. Holes in the walls, cameras hidden in bedrooms and bathrooms, wiring running to transmitters in crawl spaces or attics. One house in Altoona had 8 cameras installed. 8. Huang showed us a spreadsheet she'd created, listing the current and former tenants they'd identified going back 3 years. 22 people had lived in those houses during that time. 22 people who had no idea they'd been watched, recorded, violated in their own homes. Some had already moved away, gotten married, started families. The detectives were in the process of contacting everyone, and I could see the weight of it on Huang's face, knowing she'd have to make those phone calls and destroy people's sense of safety and privacy all over again. Brenner pulled out another folder, this one thicker, and explained that they'd executed a warrant for Vincent's financial records. He'd been paying for cloud storage, massive amounts of it, through an offshore service that specialized in, let's say, discretionary data hosting. The kind of service that doesn't ask questions and doesn't cooperate easily with law enforcement. They were working with federal investigators now because the scope had expanded beyond local jurisdiction. The FBI Cybercrimes Unit was involved, trying to trace where the footage had been uploaded and whether Vincent had distributed or sold any of it. That word "sold" hit me like a hammer. The idea that strangers might have paid money to watch me and Claire in our bedroom, that our most private moments might be saved on some server in another country, being traded around by people whose faces we'd never see. It made me want to vomit right there on the conference room table. Claire started crying again, and Huang pushed a box of tissues across the table with the kind of practiced gentleness that told me she'd done this too many times before. Brenner said they'd keep us updated, that they were doing everything possible to track Vincent down and secure any footage that might exist. But I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. The internet is vast. Data can be copied, backed up, hidden in places even experts struggle to find. We never went back to that house. Claire couldn't even drive past the street without having a panic attack, and honestly, neither could I. We broke the lease, which legally we probably didn't have to do given the circumstances, but I didn't want to spend another second tied to anything Vincent owned. We moved into a cramped apartment in Harrisburg, closer to Claire's work and her family, a place with new construction and walls we could verify were solid all the way through. I became obsessive about checking for cameras. Every hotel room, every Airbnb, even bathrooms at friends' houses, I'd find myself scanning the walls and ceilings, looking for tiny holes or unusual objects positioned at weird angles. Claire started seeing a therapist who specialized in trauma. She'd come home from sessions exhausted and raw, and some nights she'd just sit on the couch staring at nothing while I made dinner neither of us wanted to eat. Our marriage took a hit. Not because we blamed each other, but because the invasion had poisoned something fundamental between us. Intimacy became complicated, loaded with the knowledge that someone had stolen it from us, and we could never get it back. We got through it, slowly, with a lot of therapy and patience and honest conversations that hurt like open wounds. But it changed us. You don't come back from something like that completely whole. Vincent Marsh was arrested 4 months later at a border crossing in Texas, trying to get into Mexico with fake identification. The cargo van was full of hard drives and equipment. Turns out he'd been planning this for a while, had money stashed in accounts under different names, probably anticipating the day someone would discover what he'd been doing. The trial took 2 years, dragged out by legal motions and evidence processing. The FBI recovered footage from multiple cloud accounts, thousands of hours of recordings spanning back to 2011. He'd been doing this for at least a decade, maybe longer. 22 victims became 43 as more people came forward after seeing news coverage. Some of the footage had been sold on dark web forums, distributed to networks of people who paid subscription fees to watch real surveillance of unsuspecting people. Vincent pleaded guilty eventually, probably because his lawyers knew a jury would bury him. He got 38 years in federal prison, no parole. He'll be 90 when he's eligible for release, if he lives that long. Huang called me the day the sentence came down. She said it was one of the longest sentences she'd seen for this type of crime, that the judge had been visibly disgusted during sentencing. It should have felt like victory, like justice, but mostly I just felt tired. Claire and I were in our new house by then, a place we'd bought instead of rented, where we'd personally inspected every inch before signing the papers. We're okay now, or as okay as you can be after something like this. We don't talk about it much anymore, but sometimes I catch Claire staring at a wall with that distant look, and I know she's back there, in that bedroom on the edge of Fairmont, realizing someone was watching. The violation doesn't fade. You just learn to carry it differently. And every time I hear about someone finding a great deal on a rental, I want to tell them to check the walls first. Check everything. Because privacy is an illusion, and trust is a luxury not everyone deserves. Teaching 5th grade in Dalton felt like the kind of quiet life I needed after the chaos of my divorce 2 years prior. The town had maybe 8,000 people, tucked between the mountains in northwest Georgia, where everyone knew everyone and Sunday service at Covenant Fellowship wasn't optional if you wanted to fit in. I started attending because my principal, Mr. Warren, mentioned it during my interview, saying the church was the heart of the community and most of the school staff were members. Within my first month, I'd been welcomed with casseroles, invitations to potlucks, and warm smiles from people who seemed genuinely kind. The church itself was this beautiful old building with white columns and stained glass windows that threw colored light across the pews during morning service. Everything felt safe, normal, like I'd finally found a place where I could rebuild my life and focus on my students without the drama I'd left behind in Savannah. But sometime around mid-October, I started noticing small things that didn't quite add up. After service one Sunday, I saw 3 of my colleagues, including Beth Sullivan, who taught 3rd grade, huddled in the parking lot with Deacon Phillips and 2 other church elders I didn't know well. They were speaking in hushed tones, and when I waved at Beth, she looked almost startled before giving me this tight, forced smile and turning back to the group. The conversation stopped completely when I walked past them to my car. Then there was the Wednesday evening Bible study I'd started attending, where certain members would exchange these meaningful glances whenever someone mentioned the community committee, which I'd been told was just a charity organization that helped struggling families in the area. I'd asked about volunteering once, and the room had gone uncomfortably silent before someone changed the subject. People were friendly enough to my face, but I was starting to feel like there was this whole other layer to the church that I wasn't part of, like everyone was in on something I didn't understand. The warmth I'd initially felt was beginning to seem performative, calculated even, though I couldn't explain why I felt that way. The thing that really kicked everything into gear happened on a Monday morning in late October. I arrived at school to find out that Beth Sullivan had resigned effective immediately. No 2 weeks notice, no goodbye, nothing. Her classroom was already being packed up by the janitor, and when I asked Mr. Warren about it, he got this weird look on his face and said Beth had personal matters to attend to and had moved out of state to be with family. But here's the thing that made my stomach turn. I'd had coffee with Beth just 3 days earlier, on Friday afternoon, and she'd been excitedly planning her classroom Halloween party. She'd shown me the decorations she'd bought, talked about how her kids were going to love the costume contest, and mentioned she was hosting Thanksgiving at her house this year for the first time. She didn't seem like someone about to uproot her entire life. I tried calling her cell phone during my lunch break, and it went straight to a disconnected number message. Her Facebook page was gone. It was like she'd been erased. I couldn't stop thinking about it for the rest of the week. During Wednesday evening service, I noticed Beth's usual seat in the 4th pew was occupied by a family I'd never seen before, like the congregation had just moved on without missing a beat. After the service ended, I approached Deacon Phillips and asked if he knew how to reach Beth, saying I wanted to send her a card or something. The way his expression shifted made my chest tighten. He put his hand on my shoulder, this gesture that probably looked comforting to anyone watching, but his grip was firm enough to feel like a warning. He told me that Beth had made her choice, and it was best to respect her privacy and focus on my own responsibilities here. The way he emphasized here felt deliberate, pointed. When I mentioned that her phone was disconnected, he just smiled and said sometimes people need to make clean breaks, then walked away before I could ask anything else. That night, lying in bed, I kept replaying the conversation and realizing he'd never actually answered my question about how to contact her. Nobody had. The next Sunday I decided to do something probably stupid, but I couldn't help myself. After service, I lingered near the fellowship hall where coffee and donuts were set up, and I started casually asking other members if they'd heard from Beth. The reactions were all variations of the same theme: awkward pauses, quick subject changes, or these rehearsed-sounding responses about respecting her decision and moving forward. But it was Margaret Torres, the church secretary who'd always been chatty with me, who really confirmed my suspicions. When I asked her, she actually glanced around nervously before leaning in close and whispering that I should stop asking questions about Beth. Her exact words were, "Some people aren't cut out for the level of commitment this community requires, and it's better for everyone when they realize that sooner rather than later." When I pressed her on what she meant by commitment, she straightened up, plastered on a smile, and said she had to help clean up, practically speed-walking away from me. The whole exchange lasted maybe 30 seconds, but it left me feeling genuinely unsettled. What kind of church talks about commitment like it's some binding contract you can't get out of? I started paying closer attention after that, really watching how people interacted. The community committee met every other Friday evening in the church basement, and I'd see the same group of maybe 20 people heading down there. Always the same faces, including Mr. Warren, Deacon Phillips, and several other teachers from school. They'd stay for exactly 2 hours, and when they came back up, they always looked serious, purposeful, like they'd just attended some important business meeting rather than a charity planning session. One Friday in early November, I made an excuse about leaving my sweater in the sanctuary and doubled back after everyone thought I'd left. I could hear voices coming from the basement, but the door at the top of the stairs was locked. I stood there for a minute, listening, and I could make out someone talking about maintaining the structure and ensuring compliance, which seemed like really weird language for organizing food drives or whatever they were supposedly doing. Then I heard footsteps coming up the stairs and I had to scramble back to my car, my heart absolutely pounding, feeling like a kid who'd almost gotten caught doing something wrong. What really sent me down the rabbit hole was finding Beth's lesson planner in the supply closet at school. I'd gone in looking for construction paper for my class, and there it was, shoved behind some boxes on the top shelf like someone had hidden it quickly. Her handwriting was all over it, plans sketched out through December, parent conference notes, everything. On the inside cover, she'd written her sister's phone number in California with a note that said, "Emily, emergency contact." I took a photo of the number with my phone and called it that evening from my apartment. A woman answered, and when I explained who I was and asked about Beth, there was this long, painful silence before she said Beth hadn't contacted any family members. Emily's voice cracked when she told me she'd filed a missing person report 2 weeks ago, but the police in Dalton had told her that Beth had resigned from her job voluntarily, and there was no evidence of foul play, so they weren't investigating. Emily said she'd driven down from California to look for her sister, had gone to the church and spoken with Deacon Phillips, and he'd told her the same story about Beth moving away for personal reasons. But Emily knew her sister, knew Beth would never just vanish without telling family, and she'd left Dalton feeling like everyone was lying to her but having no proof of anything. After I hung up with Emily, I sat on my couch for probably an hour just trying to process what this meant. A woman had vanished, her own sister couldn't find her, and an entire church congregation was apparently okay with pretending everything was normal. I thought about going to the police myself, but what would I even say? That people at my church were acting weird and my colleague had quit her job? There was nothing concrete, nothing illegal that I could point to. The next day at school, I noticed Mr. Warren watching me more closely than usual during the staff meeting. When it ended, he asked me to stay behind, and once everyone else had filed out, he closed the door and sat on the edge of his desk in this casual way that somehow made the whole thing feel more threatening. He asked how I was adjusting to the community, if I felt welcomed at church, and then he said he'd heard I'd been asking a lot of questions about Beth Sullivan. The way he looked at me when he said it made my mouth go dry. I tried to play it off, said I was just concerned about a friend, but he cut me off and said that sometimes curiosity can make a person's life more complicated than it needs to be. Those were his exact words. Then he smiled, told me he was sure I understood, and suggested I focus on being a positive presence for my students, rather than dwelling on people who'd chosen to move on. That conversation scared me more than anything else had up to that point, because it meant they knew I was digging, and they were watching me. I decided to back off for a while, attend church like normal, smile and nod, and pretend everything was fine. But I also started documenting things, writing down dates and names and strange interactions in a notebook I kept hidden in my apartment. 2 weeks later, on a Wednesday evening, I got a knock on my door around 8 at night. When I looked through the peephole, I saw Deacon Phillips standing there with 2 other men from the community committee, both wearing suits despite the late hour. My entire body went cold. I considered not answering, but my car was parked right outside, and all the lights in my apartment were on, so they obviously knew I was home. When I opened the door with the chain still latched, Deacon Phillips gave me that same unsettling smile and said they'd like to talk to me about joining the community committee. He said I'd shown such dedication to the church and the school that they felt I'd be a perfect addition to their organization. The way he phrased it didn't sound like an invitation, it sounded like an inevitability. I told them through the gap in the door that I appreciated the offer, but I was still fairly new to the area and wanted to settle in more before taking on additional commitments. One of the other men, someone whose name I didn't know but who I'd seen at every service, stepped closer and said that membership in the committee wasn't really optional for people who were serious about being part of the Covenant Fellowship community. He said it in this matter-of-fact tone, like he was explaining simple math to a child. Deacon Phillips added that everyone at the church who held any position of influence or respect was part of the committee, and that my principal, Mr. Warren, had specifically recommended me. He said they had a special initiation meeting this coming Friday, and they'd expect to see me there at 7 in the evening. When I started to protest, to say I needed time to think about it, the third man finally spoke up and mentioned how unfortunate it had been that Beth Sullivan hadn't understood the importance of commitment, how she'd made things difficult for herself by trying to walk away. The implicit threat in his words was crystal clear. I managed to tell them I'd think about it and close the door, then immediately pushed my couch against it and spent the rest of the night planning what the hell I was going to do. I knew I couldn't just refuse and stay in Dalton. Whatever this community committee actually was, they clearly had enough influence to make people disappear without consequences, and the local police were either part of it or too intimidated to investigate. By Thursday morning, I'd made my decision. I called in sick to school, went to the bank and withdrew everything from my checking account, and started packing only what would fit in my car. I didn't give notice to my landlord, didn't tell anyone at school I was leaving, didn't post anything on social media. I loaded up my sedan that afternoon while most people were still at work, threw my notebook with all my documentation into my bag, and planned to leave Friday morning before dawn, hours before that 7 o'clock meeting they expected me at. But Thursday night, around 11, I heard footsteps on the stairs leading up to my second-floor apartment. Slow, deliberate footsteps, and then they stopped right outside my door. I held my breath in the darkness, watching the shadow of feet visible under the door gap. Whoever it was stood there for what felt like forever, but was probably only 2 or 3 minutes. Then I heard a piece of paper slide under my door. When the footsteps finally retreated, I waited another 10 minutes before turning on a light and picking up the paper. It was a printed schedule for tomorrow's initiation ceremony, with my name already typed at the top, along with a note that said, "We look forward to welcoming you into our family. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity you won't want to miss." I didn't sleep at all that night. At 3 in the morning, I grabbed my bags, left my apartment key on the counter, and walked as quietly as I could down to my car. The street was completely empty and dark except for one streetlight flickering at the end of the block. I threw everything in the trunk, got in the driver's seat, and my hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. Just as the engine started, I saw headlights turn onto my street from the far end. A dark SUV moving slowly, like it was patrolling. I didn't wait to see if it was coming for me. I pulled out and drove in the opposite direction, taking back roads out of town, constantly checking my rearview mirror for anyone following me. I drove for 6 hours straight, didn't stop except for gas, and ended up at my cousin's place in North Carolina by mid-morning. I stayed with her for 2 weeks, barely leaving her apartment, jumping at every unexpected sound. I finally worked up the courage to call Emily, Beth's sister, and told her everything that had happened to me. She broke down crying and said she'd suspected something like this but had no way to prove it. Together, we contacted the FBI field office in Charlotte, and I turned over my notebook with all the documentation. An agent took my statement and said they'd look into it, but warned me that without concrete evidence of a crime, there wasn't much they could do immediately. He did say that Dalton had come up before in relation to some financial irregularities involving a church organization, and my information might help build a case, but it could take months or even years. He strongly advised me not to return to Dalton under any circumstances. It's been 8 months since I left, and I'm teaching at a different school now in a different state, using my maiden name from before my marriage. I check the news from Dalton compulsively, looking for any updates, but there's been nothing about the church or the community committee. Beth Sullivan is still listed as a missing person with no new developments. Emily texts me sometimes, and we both hold on to this thin hope that maybe the investigation will eventually uncover something. But I'm not holding my breath. What keeps me up at night is thinking about how many people might still be trapped in that system, too afraid to leave, or too deep into whatever that organization actually does. I've had nightmares where I'm back in that church basement, where the locked door opens and I see what they were really doing down there. But I always wake up before finding out. Sometimes I wonder if I should have stayed and fought harder to expose them. But then I remember the look in Deacon Phillips's eyes when he stood at my door, and I know I made the only choice I could. I'm safe now. I have a new job and a new start. But I'll never really feel settled again. I'll always be looking around corners, always wondering if someone from Covenant Fellowship might track me down, because I'm the one who got away and talked to the FBI. That's what they took from me, even though I escaped. They took my ability to ever feel completely safe again, to trust a community, to believe that friendly faces in a small town church are actually what they appear to be. And somewhere in Dalton, Georgia, they're still meeting every other Friday in that basement, still maintaining their structure and ensuring compliance, still making people disappear when they ask too many questions. Everyone wants the full story, but here's the thing. I can't give it to them. The detectives, the therapists, my own parents sitting across from me with those desperate eyes, they all want this clean narrative with a beginning, middle, and end. What I've got instead are these jagged pieces of memory that don't fit together right, like a puzzle someone threw against a wall. What I can tell you is where it started. A Friday night in September, me and 4 friends driving out to some abandoned trailer park off Highway 56 because we were 17 and stupid and thought we were invincible. My buddy Josh had been going on about this place for weeks, saying his older brother told him squatters had turned it into some kind of commune, the kind of place where people went to disappear on purpose, he said, which should have been our first clue to stay the hell away. But when you grow up in a Kansas town where watching wheat grow counts as entertainment, an abandoned trailer park 12 miles outside town sounds like the most interesting thing that's happened all year. I remember climbing into Josh's pickup that night, the 5 of us passing around cheap vodka, laughing about nothing, completely unaware we were driving towards something that would break us all in different ways. The trailer park sat at the end of a dirt road that carved through an old cornfield, the kind that had been left to rot into these tall, dried-out husks that scraped against the truck as we drove through. Someone had spray-painted a crooked arrow on a rusted mailbox where we turned off the highway, pointing us deeper into nowhere. When Josh's headlights finally swept across the clearing, I counted maybe a dozen trailers arranged in this weird circle, most of them sagging on one side or covered in thick vines that made them look like they were being swallowed by the earth. The whole place had this carnival after dark feeling, like something that was supposed to be fun once but had turned into something else entirely. We sat there in the truck for a minute after Josh cut the engine, and that's when I heard it, this low mechanical hum coming from somewhere in the darkness. A generator, I realized, which meant someone was using electricity out here. Amber, Josh's girlfriend, said maybe we should just go, that if people were actually living here we were trespassing. But Josh was already laughing it off. He said anyone squatting in a place like this wasn't going to call the cops on some teenagers. Kevin had his door open before any of us could argue further, flashlight already on, heading toward the nearest trailer like he owned the place. The rest of us followed because that's what you do when you're 17. You follow your friends into the dark, even when every instinct you have is screaming at you to run. The first trailer Kevin approached had its door hanging open, swaying slightly in the wind. He stepped inside and we heard him moving around, his footsteps creaking on what sounded like rotted floorboards. When he came back out, he said it was empty, except for some old furniture and needles scattered everywhere. The kind with the orange caps that you see in documentaries about the opioid crisis. Josh made some joke about junkies and we moved to the next trailer, then the next, finding more of the same. Stripped mattresses, broken glass, that sour smell of mildew and something worse underneath. Stephanie hung back near the truck, her arms wrapped around herself even though it wasn't cold. She kept saying she wanted to leave, that this place felt wrong, but nobody really listened to her. We were too busy trying to act braver than we felt, shining our flashlights into dark corners and daring each other to go deeper into the trailers. It was Josh who noticed the trailer at the far end of the circle looked different from the others. Newer, or at least better maintained. The windows had curtains, actual curtains, not just sheets, and there was a concrete block serving as a front step. No vines growing up the sides. That generator sound was louder near this one, definitely coming from underneath or behind it. Kevin said we should check it out and Josh agreed immediately, like this was some kind of adventure game and we were collecting points. I remember my heart was pounding harder than it should have been, this animal part of my brain sending up warning flares, but I followed anyway because the alternative was standing alone in the dark. We approached the trailer slowly, and that's when I noticed the door wasn't just closed. It had a deadbolt on the outside. A big industrial one, the kind you'd use on a storage unit, installed where someone inside couldn't reach it. Josh touched it and the metal was new. No rust like everything else in this place. Amber asked why anyone would lock a trailer from the outside and nobody had an answer that made sense. Kevin tried the door anyway and it swung open. Unlocked, and the smell that came out was like nothing I'd ever experienced. Chemical and sweet at the same time, with this underlying rot that made my eyes water. The inside was dark except for a faint blue glow coming from somewhere in the back. We stood in the doorway, none of us wanting to be the first one to step inside, and that's when we heard it. A sound like fabric dragging across floor, coming from deeper in the trailer. Something or someone was in there with us, moving in the darkness. Josh shined his flashlight toward the sound, and the beam landed on a figure slumped against the far wall, a woman maybe in her 20s or 30s. It was hard to tell. She was staring at us but not really seeing us. Her eyes glassy and unfocused, and her lips were moving like she was talking, but no sound was coming out. She wore a stained tank top and her arms were covered in track marks, some fresh enough that they still looked angry and red. Kevin started backing up immediately, saying we needed to get out of there, that this was someone's shooting gallery and we were going to get in serious trouble. But Amber moved forward instead, asking the woman if she was okay, if she needed help. The woman's head lolled to the side, and she made this wet clicking sound in her throat. And I realized she wasn't just high, she was barely conscious, maybe overdosing right in front of us. Stephanie was already running back to the truck, yelling that she was calling 911. But Josh grabbed her and said we couldn't call the cops because we'd been drinking and we'd all get arrested. We were arguing about what to do, our voices getting louder and more panicked, when I heard footsteps outside. Heavy boots on gravel, multiple sets coming from different directions. The generator sound cut out and everything went silent, except for those footsteps getting closer. I don't remember making the decision to hide. My body just moved on its own, pulling me deeper into the trailer, away from the door. Josh and Amber ducked down behind a couch that was leaking stuffing, and Kevin pressed himself against the wall near the bathroom. The woman on the floor didn't react at all, just kept staring at nothing with that slack expression. Then there were voices outside, men's voices, speaking in quick Spanish that I couldn't fully understand, but the tone was clear. They were angry about something. A flashlight beam swept through the open door and someone shouted, asking who was out there, who'd been in their property. The beam landed on Stephanie, who'd only made it halfway to the truck before the lights came on. She stood there like a deer on the highway, caught completely, and I watched through the grimy window as 3 men emerged from between the trailers. They weren't what I expected. No face tattoos or gang colors, just regular-looking guys in work clothes, the kind you'd see at any construction site or farm supply store. One of them had a pistol tucked into his waistband. He walked up to Stephanie and asked her real calm where her friends were. Said he knew she hadn't come alone because he'd seen the truck. She didn't answer, couldn't answer probably, and he grabbed her arm and started walking her toward the center of the circle, toward the other trailers we hadn't explored yet. That's when Josh made the stupidest decision of his life and ran out after her. He was yelling something about leaving her alone, about how we were just kids and we'd leave and never come back. But his voice cracked halfway through and it just sounded pathetic and desperate. The man with the gun didn't even hesitate. He pulled it out and pointed it at Josh's chest, told him to get on his knees right now or he'd put a hole in him. Josh dropped like his legs had been cut out from under him. Amber started crying next to me, these quiet hiccuping sobs she was trying to muffle with her hand, and I clamped my own hand over her mouth because I knew if they heard us, we were done. Through the window, I watched as two more men appeared, one of them talking on a cell phone in rapid Spanish, and I caught enough words to understand they were calling someone, asking what to do about the kids who'd found the place. The man on the phone kept saying CC and nodding, and when he hung up, his face looked grim. He walked over to Josh and Stephanie and told them they were going to take a little walk, that if they cooperated, nobody had to get hurt. Josh asked what about his friends in the truck, lying badly, and the man smiled this thin smile and said they'd find them too, not to worry. They started walking, the two of them, toward the far side of the circle, toward trailers I now realized had been modified somehow, with metal reinforcements around the doors and windows that looked like bars. Kevin whispered that we had to run, right now while they were distracted, but I couldn't move. I was watching Josh and Stephanie being led away and my brain was screaming at me to do something, anything, but my body wouldn't respond. Then the woman on the floor behind us started making this horrible keening sound, this animal noise of pure distress, and one of the men heard it. He turned back toward our trailer and started walking, calling out to someone named Luis, saying he needed to check on the girl in number 7. That was us. We were in number 7. Amber bolted first, running out the back window that someone had left partially open, and Kevin went right after her. I should have followed immediately, but I hesitated for maybe 3 seconds, looking at that woman on the floor, who was clearly a prisoner here, clearly someone who needed help. And those 3 seconds cost me everything. The man came through the door just as I was climbing toward the window, and he grabbed my ankle and pulled hard. I hit the floor, and all the air went out of my lungs, and when I looked up, there was a different man standing over me, older than the others, with graying hair and these absolutely dead eyes. He said something in Spanish to the guy holding me, then switched to English and told me I'd made a very big mistake tonight. That they'd been running a good operation here for 2 years without problems, and now they had to figure out what to do with a bunch of nosy kids who couldn't mind their own business. They zip-tied my hands behind my back and walked me to one of the modified trailers, the one with the heaviest bars on the windows. Inside it was divided into compartments, these small rooms created with plywood walls that didn't reach the ceiling, and I could hear people in the other sections, breathing, shifting, someone crying softly. They shoved me into one of these rooms and the door had a padlock on the outside, just like that first trailer. The space was maybe 6 feet by 8 feet, with a thin mattress on the floor and a bucket in the corner that I didn't want to think about. There was sound insulation stapled to the walls, the kind you see in recording studios, which explained why nobody outside had ever heard anything from this place. Josh was in the compartment next to mine. I could hear him through the thin plywood, asking if I was okay, his voice shaking. Stephanie was somewhere further down, calling out for Amber and Kevin, begging them to get help. One of the men banged on the wall and told us to shut up or he'd give us something to really cry about. The hours that followed are the blurriest part of my memory. I know we were kept in those rooms while they decided what to do with us. I know they brought us water and these protein bars that tasted like cardboard, keeping us alive but barely. I know Josh tried to kick his door down at some point and they came in and beat him badly enough that he stopped making noise for a long time. What I learned later, after everything, was that Amber and Kevin had made it back to the highway. They'd run through that cornfield in complete darkness, getting cut up by the dried stalks, and flagged down a semi-truck around 3 in the morning. The driver let them use his CB radio to call for help, and they told the police everything: the trailer park, the men with guns, their 3 friends who'd been taken. But here's the thing about Kansas County police departments at 3 in the morning. They're understaffed and skeptical, especially when 2 drunk teenagers show up with a story about armed men and kidnapping in an abandoned trailer park that most locals didn't even know existed. The officer who responded thought they were either pulling a prank or had gotten into some kind of drug deal gone wrong. He drove out to Highway 56 with them at dawn, but couldn't find the turnoff they described. That spray-painted arrow on the mailbox was gone, painted over with brown that matched the rust. The dirt road through the cornfield had been smoothed out somehow, and without that clear path, the officer didn't want to drive his cruiser through private farmland on the word of 2 scared kids who couldn't give him an exact location. He took a report and told them he'd follow up, but Amber said she could tell he didn't believe them. It took 3 days and both sets of parents raising hell before the sheriff's department organized a real search, and by then we'd been moved. They transported us at night in a panel van with no windows, drove for what felt like hours on roads that went from paved to gravel to dirt. When they finally let us out, we were at a different location entirely, some kind of warehouse or industrial building that smelled like chemicals and had these huge ventilation fans running constantly. The operation was bigger than I'd understood. There were maybe 20 other people being held there, ranging from teenagers to people in their 40s, all in various states of withdrawal or sedation. I realized we'd stumbled into something way beyond a local drug operation. They were using people as mules, as labor, as leverage against family members who owed money. The man with the dead eyes, the one who seemed to be in charge, told us we'd work off our debt for trespassing and causing problems. He said we'd ruined a good setup and cost them money and having to relocate, so now we owed them. Josh kept insisting we were just kids, that our parents would pay whatever they wanted, but the man laughed and said our parents couldn't pay what we'd cost them. For weeks, maybe months, time stopped meaning anything in that place. We sorted pills, packaged powder into baggies, loaded and unloaded trucks that came in the middle of the night. They kept us compliant with just enough food to function and occasional doses of something that made everything feel far away and unimportant. Stephanie stopped talking after the first week. Josh tried to escape once and they broke 3 of his fingers as a lesson to the rest of us. The fragmented memories I have are mostly from this period. Days blending together, the constant noise of those ventilation fans, the chemical taste in my mouth that never went away. But I also remember the moment everything changed. A woman showed up one day, someone new they'd brought in, and she was different from the rest of us. She wasn't scared, she was angry, loudly, violently angry, screaming at the guards about a lawyer and her husband, and how people knew where she was. They tried to shut her up, but she wouldn't stop, and I think that's what finally brought attention to the place. Because 3 days after she arrived, I woke up to the sound of doors being smashed in and men in tactical gear yelling for everyone to get on the ground. Federal agents, it turned out, DEA and FBI. They'd been investigating the drug ring for over a year, but couldn't find their main distribution center until this woman, a county prosecutor's wife who'd been grabbed by mistake, a case of mistaken identity, went missing, and her husband tore apart every lead with resources we never had. They raided 4 locations simultaneously that morning in January, recovered 37 people total, and arrested 23 men connected to an operation that stretched from the Midwest to the East Coast. Josh, Stephanie, and I were separated immediately, taken to different hospitals, debriefed by so many different agencies that their faces all blur together now. My parents cried when they saw me, and I couldn't cry back. I'd forgotten how, somewhere in those months. The worst part was learning that Kevin had died 2 weeks after escaping. Carbon monoxide poisoning in his garage, his truck running, officially ruled an accident, but everyone who knew him understood what it really was. The guilt of leaving us behind had eaten him alive. They tell me I should feel lucky to be alive, that most people in situations like ours don't come home at all. The prosecutors used our testimony to put away the main operators for life, and the FBI shut down the entire network. That trailer park off Highway 56 was bulldozed within a month of our rescue. The whole area fenced off and turned into nothing, like it never existed at all. Josh moved to Colorado with his family right after the trials ended. I heard he's doing better now, working at a ski resort, trying to build a normal life. Stephanie's in intensive therapy somewhere on the East Coast. Her parents won't say where exactly. Amber finished high school online and left town the day she turned 18. I stayed because running felt like letting them win, even though I see that warehouse every time I close my eyes and smell those chemicals every time it rains. My high school graduating class walked in 2014 and I wasn't there. I was still doing physical therapy, still trying to remember how to be a person instead of just a body that follows orders. Sometimes people recognize me around town, the kid who survived that thing with the drug trailers, and they get this look like they want to ask questions but don't know how. I don't blame them. I wouldn't know what to ask either. The detectives say my fragmented memory is normal for trauma, that pieces might come back or they might not, and I should focus on moving forward instead of trying to reconstruct everything. But here's what I know for certain. There are more places like that warehouse out there. More operations running right now in spaces people drive past every day without noticing. And there are still people in those places, waiting for someone to stumble across them the way we did, hoping their luck turns out better than ours. My cousin Rita had this way of making everything seem fixable, even when it wasn't. Wednesday evening in January 2024, I sat at her kitchen table just outside Springfield, Missouri, signing papers that ended my marriage while she heated up leftover pot roast and told me about her plans for spring planting. My birthday had passed the week before. 39 felt different than 38 somehow, heavier. And here I was starting from scratch with a new apartment in town, and a job that kept me staring at wrecked cars all day. Insurance adjusting pays decent, but it teaches you to see damage everywhere, calculate loss like it's just numbers on a form. Rita kept the conversation light, asked about work, avoided mentioning my ex-wife's name. By the time I left around 7, the sun had already set, leaving that dead gray light that makes Missouri winter feel twice as cold. County Road 48 was my usual route home, 40 minutes of farmland and scattered houses set so far back from the road you could barely see them. I'd driven it 100 times, knew every curve and dip. Around mile marker 31, my 2015 Ford F-150 started making this grinding noise that shot straight through the floorboard. The engine shuddered hard, the whole truck vibrated, and then everything just quit. I managed to coast onto the shoulder near a beaten mailbox with Pruitt spray-painted crooked across the front. Tried the ignition 3 times, got nothing but clicking and that horrible metal-on-metal sound. One car passed without slowing, taillights vanishing around the bend like it couldn't get away fast enough. I pulled out my phone, saw 2 bars of signal, and searched for a tow truck. Most of the big companies showed wait times over an hour. Then I found Anchor Towing. Local number, promised 15-minute response, available all hours. I called, and a man answered so fast I barely heard it ring, his voice gravelly and worn, like he'd been waiting by the phone. He asked where I was, and I told him County Road 48, near the Pruitt mailbox at mile marker 31. He didn't ask for more details, didn't need the make and model of my truck, nothing about what was wrong with it. Just said, "Yeah, I know where that is. Be there in 10, and hung up before I could even say thanks. The whole call lasted maybe 20 seconds. I sat there in the cab, heater still blowing cold air because the engine was dead, and realized I hadn't asked about the price or what shop he was taking me to. But honestly, I just wanted to get home, peel off these clothes that still smelled like Rita's kitchen, and sleep for about 12 hours straight. The road stayed empty. No headlights in either direction. Just the wind pushing dead leaves across the asphalt, and the distant shape of a barn I could barely make out against the darkening sky. Then, headlights appeared from the direction I'd come. moving fast. Way faster than you'd expect a tow truck to move, especially on a road like this with all its turns. The lights swept around the bend, and I could see it wasn't one of those big professional rigs with the company name plastered across the side in bright letters. It was a Chevy Silverado, maybe early 2000s, dark blue or black, hard to tell in the fading light. It had a tow bar welded to the back and one of those yellow rotating beacons on the roof, the kind you can buy at any auto parts store and stick on with a magnet. On the driver's door was a decal, Anchor Towing, with an anchor symbol and a phone number, but it looked homemade, like someone had printed it on their computer and stuck it on with adhesive. The truck pulled up behind mine and the driver got out, leaving his headlights on so they lit up the whole scene in harsh white light that made everything look strange and flat. The guy who stepped out was tall, maybe 6'2", wearing a stained Carhartt jacket and jeans that had seen better days. His face was hard to make out with the headlights behind him, but I could see he was older, probably in his 50s, with a gray beard that needed trimming and a baseball cap pulled low. He walked up to my window, and I rolled it down, cold air rushing in. He smelled like cigarettes and motor oil, that combination every mechanic seems to carry around like cologne. "Engine's done, huh?" he said, not really asking. His voice was the same one from the phone, rough and flat, no warmth in it. I nodded and explained the grinding noise, how everything just died, and he listened without looking at me, his eyes scanning my truck like he was appraising it. When I finished talking, he just said, "I'll hook you up, take you to my shop. It's about 20 minutes from here, just off Highway 12. He didn't mention a price, didn't ask if I wanted to call anyone, didn't hand me a business card or a form to sign. He worked fast, moving around to the back of my truck with a chain that clanked loud in the quiet. I got out to watch, mostly because sitting in the cab doing nothing made me feel useless, and also because some part of me, the part that spends all day documenting accident scenes, wanted to see how he was rigging it up. The setup looked solid enough, chains looped through the frame, hooks secured, but there was something sloppy about it, like he'd done this 1,000 times and stopped caring about the details. He worked without talking, didn't make small talk about the weather or ask what I did for a living, none of that casual conversation tow truck drivers usually throw at you to fill the silence. When he finished, he straightened up and said, "You can ride with me or stay in your truck, doesn't matter." His tone made it clear he didn't care either way. I hesitated, looking between his Silverado and my F-150, and something in my gut twitched, just a small, uncomfortable feeling I couldn't name. But I was tired, emotionally wrung out, and this guy was my ride. I told him I'd stay in my truck. He shrugged like I'd just told him the sky was blue and walked back to his Silverado without another word. I climbed into my F-150, settled into the driver's seat even though I had no control anymore, and watched through the rear window as he got into his truck. The engine rumbled to life, louder than it should have been, and then we started moving. The jerk when we first pulled onto the road was rough, rattled my teeth, but then it smoothed out into this weird gliding feeling, being pulled along by someone else's momentum. I kept my phone in my hand, screen lit up showing 7:30, and watched the road slide past in reverse through my side mirror. We went maybe 2 miles before he made a turn I didn't recognize, onto a narrower road with no street sign, just gravel and dirt packed hard from years of use. Trees pressed in close on both sides, branches scraping the top of my truck with this rhythmic scratching sound that set my nerves on edge. That's when I realized I had no idea where this shop was supposed to be. He'd said Highway 12, but we were heading away from it, deeper into back roads I'd never been on. I tried to remember if there were any repair shops out this way and came up blank. My phone still had 1 bar of signal, just barely hanging on. I thought about calling Rita, telling her where I was, but what would I even say? That I had a bad feeling about the tow truck driver who was doing exactly what I'd paid him to do. That sounded paranoid, like the stress of the day was making me see danger where there wasn't any. But my hands wouldn't stop gripping the phone tighter, and I kept watching the trees pass by, looking for something familiar, some landmark that would tell me we were going the right direction. Nothing. Just more trees, more darkness, and that horrible scratching sound every time a branch dragged across my roof. Then he turned again, onto an even smaller road, barely wide enough for 2 vehicles, and the pavement gave way entirely to dirt. The beacon on his roof kept spinning, throwing yellow light across the trees in sick rotating patterns. We'd been driving for maybe 15 minutes when he slowed down near a clearing on the left side of the road. Through the windshield, I could see the outline of a structure, maybe a shed or a small building, set back about 30 feet from the road. No lights on inside, no sign, nothing that looked like a legitimate repair shop. Just a dark shape against darker trees. My entire body went rigid. This wasn't right. None of this was right. He pulled to a stop and the Silverado's engine kept running, that rough idle vibrating through the chains into my truck. I watched him in the side mirror, saw him open his door and step out, moving toward the back where the chains were connected. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to do something, but I was hooked to his truck, couldn't drive away even if my engine worked. My phone showed no signal now, just an empty bar mocking me in the corner of the screen. I locked my doors, stupid, pointless, but it was all I could think to do. He appeared at my window, standing there in the yellow rotating light, and tapped on the glass with his knuckle. Not aggressive, just a casual tap, like he had all the time in the world. I didn't roll it down. Through the glass, I could see his face clearly now, and there was something empty in his expression, mechanical, like he was going through motions he'd rehearsed. He said something I couldn't hear through the window, gestured toward the building. I shook my head, held up my phone, pointed at the screen showing no signal, then made a gesture like I was calling someone. Universal sign for, I'm not getting out. I have people who know where I am. Complete lie, but I sold it hard. His face didn't change. He stood there for what felt like 10 minutes but was probably 30 seconds, just staring at me through the glass. Then he did something I wasn't expecting. He pulled out his own phone, looked at it, put it back in his pocket and walked back to his truck without saying another word. I heard his door slam and then nothing happened. We just sat there, his engine running, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. Then headlights appeared behind us, coming up the dirt road fast. A vehicle rounded the bend, high beams cutting through the darkness, and I've never been so relieved to see another human being in my entire life. It was a patrol car, county sheriff, and it pulled up maybe 20 feet behind the Silverado with its lights going. A deputy got out, flashlight in hand, and walked up to the driver's side of the tow truck. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I could see the deputy's posture change, see him step back and put his hand near his belt. The conversation lasted maybe 2 minutes, and then the deputy walked over to my window. I rolled it down immediately, cold air rushing in along with the sound of the deputy's radio crackling. He was young, maybe late 20s, with a clean-shaved face and sharp eyes that took in everything. "Sir, are you all right?" he asked, and his voice had that careful calm cops use when they think something's wrong, but don't want to spook anyone. I told him I'd called for a tow. My truck broke down on County Road 48, and this guy showed up saying he'd take me to his shop. The deputy nodded slowly, glanced back at the Silverado, then asked me, "Did you get a card or any paperwork from him?" I said no, and his jaw tightened just slightly. The deputy told me to stay put and walked back to the Silverado. Whatever he said to the driver made the guy get out of his truck with his hands visible, and within minutes another patrol car showed up, then another. They had the driver standing by the hood of his Silverado, talking to him, checking his identification, running something on their radios. One of the deputies came over and explained they'd been looking for this guy for 3 weeks. Apparently there'd been a string of incidents, people calling for tow trucks on rural roads, drivers showing up fast with homemade decals and no legitimate business license, then either robbing the stranded motorists or, in 2 cases, the people in their vehicles just vanished entirely until their trucks were found abandoned days later in different counties. The fake tow driver would target people alone on empty roads, use the isolation against them, and the decal on his door could peel right off when he was done. They'd been tracking reports but couldn't pin him down until tonight. The deputy said the only reason they found me was because someone had called in a suspicious vehicle, matching the description heading down this road. Probably a neighbor who'd seen the beacon light through the trees and thought it was strange. They unhooked my truck right there on the dirt road and called a legitimate towing company out of Springfield to come get me. Took another hour before they arrived, and I spent that time sitting in the back of a patrol car with a blanket around my shoulders, watching them process the scene. The building in the clearing turned out to be an abandoned hunting cabin. Nothing inside but some old furniture and evidence of other people having been there recently. Rope, duct tape, a toolbox. The deputy who'd found me said I'd gotten lucky in ways I probably didn't fully understand yet, that staying in my truck and refusing to get out had likely saved my life. When the real tow truck finally showed up, a bright red rig with the company name in huge letters and a driver who had paperwork and a business card, and asked me a dozen questions about my insurance, I felt like I could breathe again. They took me and my F-150 to a shop in town, and I called Rita from there around midnight to tell her what happened. She cried, which made me realize how close I'd actually come to not making that call at all. The guy they arrested turned out to have a record: assault, theft, a bunch of other charges going back years. I had to give a statement to the police, went through the whole thing again in detail, and they told me I'd probably have to testify if it went to trial. I said I would, absolutely, whatever they needed. That was 3 months ago now, and I still won't drive County Road 48 at night. Still check the credentials of any service person before they touch my vehicle. Still get a knot in my chest when I see a tow truck beacon spinning in the dark. Some guy in a fake uniform with a homemade decal almost made me disappear, and the only reason I'm here typing this is because I listened to that small, uncomfortable feeling in my gut and refused to get out of my truck. Trust that feeling. Always. Folks around our town always said the bridge at Mason Creek had a bad feeling to it. It sits about 3 miles past the diner where I work, tucked behind a patch of pine trees and fog that never really lifts. The asphalt there crumbles into dirt, and when the wind blows through, it whistles through the cracks like the bridge is breathing. I had lived in Claymore all my life, waiting tables since I was 18, and I knew every regular's car by sight. That is why, when I drove home after my shift one night and saw a silver Honda parked near the guardrail with no lights on, it caught my attention immediately. At first, I figured someone broke down. Happens all the time when folks take the back roads to avoid the state patrol. But when I passed by the next night and saw a different car in almost the same spot, an old maroon Buick this time, I felt a strange sense of repetition that stuck with me. People in town started whispering about it too. A delivery guy said he'd seen 3 cars left there in the last week, always after midnight, always gone by morning. Nobody knew who they belonged to, and nobody really wanted to stop and check. Then came the night I noticed a beat-up blue Ford Fusion parked right under the bridge's main arch. I recognized it right away. It belonged to Casey, one of the waitresses who worked the late shift with me at the diner. Casey had been covering extra hours because her boyfriend lost his job, and she usually left around the same time I did. Seeing her car sitting there, engine off, door slightly cracked open, made my chest tighten in a way I can't fully describe. I pulled over a little ahead of the bridge, cut the headlights, and just sat there, watching the Ford. The whole place was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears. The bridge lights had gone out years ago, so the only thing I could see was the faint gleam of metal from the car's bumper catching my high beams. I called Casey's phone, no answer. Tried again, nothing. That was when I noticed a faint flicker of light inside her car, like someone using a flashlight or maybe a lighter. It blinked twice, then disappeared. For a few seconds I thought about turning around and pretending I never saw it. But curiosity has always been my worst habit. I stepped out of my car, leaving the engine idling just in case I needed to bolt. The air smelled like wet iron, sharp and heavy. My shoes crunched against the gravel as I moved closer to Casey's car, calling her name softly. No answer. I peeked through the driver's window and saw her purse still on the seat, Her phone face down beside it, the screen cracked. But the back seat was empty. That small light I'd seen earlier wasn't there anymore, and the silence felt deeper, as if the woods had stopped breathing too. Something about that bridge always messed with radios, but I had my work walkie-talkie in my apron pocket from the diner. It wasn't meant for long distance, yet a faint voice came through when I turned it on. Static first, then a man's voice. Steady, low, like he was talking right next to my ear. "You out here too?" he said. I froze in place, listening. The signal hissed, then he spoke again. "Bridge is quiet tonight, just the way I like it." His tone was calm, almost conversational, which somehow made it worse. I backed away from the car, keeping my eyes on the dark stretch of bridge ahead. There were faint tire marks near the guardrail, fresh ones that hadn't been there before. That was when I heard it. The slow grind of a diesel engine starting somewhere beyond the trees. The kind of deep rumble you feel in your ribs. The sound echoed under the bridge, bouncing around like it had nowhere else to go. I crouched behind Casey's car, heart hammering, and watched as a semi-truck's headlights blinked on in the distance. It crept forward like it was stalking something. The driver never used the horn, never flashed the brights, just rolled closer until the grille reflected in the water beneath the bridge. I caught a glimpse of the trailer's paint, dull red with peeling white letters that might have once spelled a company name. I remember thinking that whoever was behind that wheel wasn't just passing through. They were waiting. The truck stopped in the middle of the bridge, its headlights dimmed, leaving everything bathed in weak moonlight. A voice crackled through my walkie again. Same man, same calm tone. "She came out to meet me, you know. Said she heard me calling." My chest tightened. Casey had told me once she liked to listen to old CB channels while closing up the diner. Said they made the drive home less lonely. The man kept talking, describing her hair, her voice, how she sounded scared when she realized there was no signal down here. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move fast enough. Then the truck's door opened. I could see the driver's outline against the cab light, broad shoulders, baseball cap, face hidden by shadow. He leaned out and tossed something over the bridge rail. It hit the water with a soft splash. I felt my throat close up. The radio clicked again, quieter now. Sometimes they answer, sometimes they don't. His engine roared back to life, and the truck rolled off into the trees, taillights fading until the night swallowed them whole. I didn't go to the police until morning. When they checked the bridge, they found Casey's phone, the same one I'd seen in her car, shattered near the guardrail. They said the signal from her last call had bounced off an unregistered frequency, one the highway patrol hadn't used in decades. A few weeks later, they traced similar disappearances to truck stops along the interstate, each near a bridge, each victim last heard talking on CB channels no one was supposed to be using anymore. To this day, that stretch of road stays empty after dark. People in Claymore say it's haunted, but I don't think it's ghosts keeping folks away. Sometimes late at night, the diner's radio picks up faint chatter from a channel that shouldn't exist. Just a man's voice, clear as if he's sitting at the counter. "Anyone out there near the bridge?" he says. "It's real quiet tonight." Classes had been exhausting that semester, and I was desperate for a quiet weekend to make some money. When my roommate mentioned a family who needed a babysitter for 2 nights, it felt like a perfect break from the campus chaos. The family lived in a tidy 2-story house on the edge of a small Oregon town. Quiet, tree-lined streets where everyone seemed to know each other. The mother, Erin, met me at the door with the kind of warmth that felt practiced, but not unkind. Her husband, Patrick, was supposedly leaving that evening for a business trip to Portland, and the 2 kids, Max and Lily, were already in their pajamas when I arrived. Erin gave me a quick tour of the house, moving a little too fast through each room, pointing out the snacks, the camera monitors, the back door, the alarm code. She kept saying how much she appreciated me coming on short notice. Her voice trembled just slightly when she mentioned Patrick's trip, but I brushed it off as exhaustion. Before she left, she kissed both kids on the forehead, reminded me not to open the door for anyone, and promised to be back by late morning. When the door clicked shut, the silence in that big house felt heavier than it should have. The night started out fine. Max and Lily were good kids, restless but polite. We played a board game, watched an old animated movie, and they fell asleep by 9. After cleaning up the living room, I sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea, scrolling through my phone, while the soft hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. The only light came from the little night bulb over the sink, making everything look faded and distant. The house felt peaceful, almost too still, like it was waiting for something. Around midnight, the first knock came. 3 dull taps on the back door, slow and deliberate. I figured it might be a neighbor, someone who had noticed Aaron's car gone and wanted to check in. Still, something in the rhythm of those knocks made me hesitate. I opened the kitchen tablet to check the porch camera. The grainy feed lit up, and I swear my breath caught when I saw the man on the screen. Patrick, standing there in the cold, his face lit by the porch light. At first I thought maybe the trip had been canceled, but something about the way he stood there, completely still, staring straight into the camera, made my throat tighten. He wasn't knocking anymore, just standing in the same position, his hands at his sides. The porch light flickered once and the feed glitched for half a second. When it came back, he was gone. I remember walking to the door and checking the lock twice before stepping back and texting Erin. No answer. Then I called her. Straight to voicemail. A few minutes later, a soft scratching sound came from the side of the house, like branches scraping the siding, except there were no trees close enough for that. I turned off the kitchen light to get a clearer view through the window. Outside, the yard looked empty. The swing set in the corner moved slightly, just enough to catch the light. I could not tell if it was the wind or something else. I told myself I was being paranoid. Still, I grabbed the house phone. Yes, an actual landline, and kept it next to me. When the knocks started again, they were louder, faster. The kids upstairs began to stir. I heard Max's small voice call out, asking if everything was okay. I lied and told him it was just a neighbor. My voice must have sounded wrong because he came to the top of the stairs, clutching a blanket. I told him to stay with his sister, locked the kitchen door again, and turned the deadbolt twice. Then I checked the camera feed one more time. Patrick was back. His face was closer now, his expression flat, as if he were watching something beyond the lens. I dialed 911 with shaking fingers, whispering the address while keeping my eyes on the screen. The dispatcher asked me if I was sure it was the homeowner. I said yes, absolutely sure. She told me officers were on their way and to stay inside. I remember feeling this strange mixture of relief and disbelief. I had seen his face earlier that evening when he hugged the kids goodbye. There was no mistaking him, but the man on that screen looked wrong somehow. The same features, same clothes, but a blankness in his eyes that I can't describe. The police took about 15 minutes to arrive, though it felt much longer. During that time, I kept every light in the house off and sat at the bottom of the stairs listening. I could hear something faint outside, footsteps crunching against the gravel, slow and uneven. Then the sound of a car door shutting somewhere nearby. I waited for a knock at the front door, but it never came. When red and blue lights finally flashed through the curtains, I ran to open the door before they even stepped out of the car. 2 officers searched the property while one stayed with me and the kids. They found footprints near the back porch, leading toward the woods that bordered the neighborhood. I remember one of them saying the prints matched heavy boots, not sneakers or dress shoes. When they ran Patrick's name through their system, the mood shifted instantly. One of the officers made a quick call and stepped outside. A few minutes later, he came back pale-faced and told me Patrick was confirmed to be in Portland. His body had been found in a motel parking lot earlier that evening. Erin returned the next morning in tears, escorted by detectives. The truth unfolded in fragments. Months of violence hidden behind closed doors, reports she never filed, neighbors who suspected but stayed quiet. Patrick had apparently left town 2 days earlier after a violent argument, but something or someone wearing his face came back that night. The officers never found any signs of forced entry, and the camera feed from that moment somehow vanished from the cloud storage before they could retrieve it. I quit babysitting after that. Aaron and the kids moved away not long later. Every once in a while, I'll see a man on the street with the same posture, the same way of standing perfectly still like Patrick did on that porch. And for a second, I feel that same pressure in my chest, like the air is too thick. I try not to think about what I saw on that screen, or who, if anyone, was actually standing outside that door.